In a dramatic show of air power, the U.S. Air Force's Hill Air Force Base just sortied 52 F-35A fighter bombers. The jets massed on the runway and then took off, one after the other, into a clear Utah sky. The Air Force claims the timing of the exercise as the U.S. enters a new crisis with Iran is purely coincidental, and the exercise was planned months in advance. The exercise took place at Hill Air Force Base in Utah. Hill was the first Air Force base to become fully operational with the F-16 Fighting Falcon more than 30 years ago, and history is repeating itself with the F-35A. Hill is home to the only 4 combat-capable F-35A squadrons in the U.S. Air Force, split between the active-duty 388th Fighter Wing and the reserve 419th Fighter Wing. After launch, 24 of the jets were refueled in midair by KC-135 Stratotankers. The Hill Air Force Base received the last of 78 F-35As in December 2019. To commemorate the occasion, the base decided to conduct what the U.S. military calls an elephant walk, a mass sortie of aircraft. The walk starts with a surge of fighters from their hangars. Then all of the planes are launched into the air one after the other. According to the base, currently the wings fly 30 to 60 sorties per day from Hill's flight line. During the exercise, airmen launched roughly the same number of daily sorties, but they took off in quick intervals. Elephant walks are a show of force, demonstrating the might and power of the U.S. Air Force. They're also expensive. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter cost $44,000 an hour to fly, far more than its predecessor, the F-16. If each aircraft involved in the exercise flew for approximately 2 hours, that's a combined operating cost of $4.5 million. For the cost of 17 exercises, the Air Force could buy a brand new F-35A. The service and manufacturer, Lockheed Martin, are struggling to get the cost per hour down, which left unchecked could force the Pentagon to buy fewer planes. That having been said, the Air Force does get something out of the exercise. The entire base trains for the event, giving pilots and maintainers a fixed date to get a large number of jets ready to take to the skies. Once the planes are ready, the base must work to launch and recover 52 fighter jets. It's not a war scenario, but is one that exercises virtually the entire base's muscles. In an announcement, Hill Air Force Base stated, launching aircraft from multiple squadrons simultaneously presents various challenges and allows the wings to evaluate the capabilities of maintenance professionals as well as pilots and command and control teams. The elephant walk is also evidence the F-35 is growing easier to maintain. In 2018, as Air Force Magazine points out, the F-35 had a reliability rate of 66%. By late last year, their reliability rate had risen to 75%. According to the base, the 34th Fighter Squadron is currently flying in the Middle East. That means a very high number, likely higher than 75% of remaining F-35As were able to take part in the exercise. An encouraging sign for a fighter plane that's seen more than a decade of controversy.
Hank's always got his tool belt with him. Now Hank is living with prostate cancer. He still knows how to
now.
I've got I'm sure he remembers it, but I've got a video at home of a demonstration he did at Clark Air Force Base in 1960 in an Indonesian F-86. Most beautiful thing I think I've ever seen. I know I've watched it at least 100 times, and to think that I'd be personal friends with a guy like Dale Snodgrass after I've watched him for years is something that's just a real honor for me. So I mean, these guys, it's just a real, it's more than I can describe to be here with these guys. Anyway, I'm like a lot of people that grew up in my era. I was a little too young to fly the F-86, and sometimes I regret that, but it was the airplane I grew up with, built models of whenever I was a child. Always thought it was the prettiest airplane. Still do think it's just what a jet airplane should look like, and it's just beautiful. And I got to see it fly this morning from the ground. The first time I'd ever did that when Dale flew it in a photo shoot. But it's everything I ever thought it would be. I thought maybe one day I'd get to touch one. If anybody could ever told me I'd ever own one, I would have just said no, that's not the way it is. But God's blessed me in a lot of ways, and I'm just thankful that I'm able to own and fly an airplane like this. It has so much history. The airplane, instead of taking time, I'll get to the airplane, but the airplane, this airplane has a tremendous amount of history to it. It was originally made in Canada. It's a Canadair Mark 6. This one has the big engine in it. The American version had 5,200 pounds of thrust. This one has 7,400 pounds, so it's about a 50% more power than the American version, which makes it really a lot of fun to fly. I didn't really realize all the history it had when I bought the airplane. I saw it advertised for sale, and it was a Flight Systems airplane. And those of you who don't know the history of Flight Systems, the company itself has a lot of history with F-86s. They did a lot of top secret chase maneuvers. Bob Laidlaw picked this airplane out of a bunch of parts that they had, and then put all new parts on it, built it, and it was his personal airplane. And he flew. He was a test pilot with North American, and he later on Flight Systems. And during its tenure with Flight Systems, it was a dart tow aircraft, which we've got a picture here of it towing a large dart. And what they had a reel. When I bought the airplane, it had a reel back behind it, and a cable where they would pull out they would release this dart and go out with a 1,200-foot cable, go into a 4G turn with the airplane, and whip it around in a real big circle, and the F-15s would shoot at it. But anyway, it was just briefly, the airplane was it was a chase plane on the B-58 Hustler program. It was a chase plane on some of the scramjet development. It was a chase plane on the Redstone missile, the Cessna Citation, the Canadair Challenger, and a lot of other things that Bob Laidlaw did with it. It was it was used in a couple of movies, and I've been told, Bob can probably tell you about it, but I've been told that Bob flew the airplane whenever Bob Laidlaw had it, whenever it was with Flight Systems, in Flight Systems livery. The other thing that's really unique about the airplane, it's just a real honor for me to be able to correspond with Colonel James Castler. Colonel James Castler is the most highly decorated airman in U.S. history. He was in the Hanoi Hilton for 7 years with James Stockwell, about an incredible American. And Colonel Castler started as a B-29 tail gunner in World War II, and he went on to become an ace in Korea, flying the F-86. And between that and his time in Vietnam, he went to Canada as an exchange instructor, and he flew this airplane. This airplane was his personal airplane in Canada when he flew in Canada. And there was all along there's been questions about, well, people say that he bellied this airplane in. They had a problem with it and bellied this airplane in. And but in Canada, but there's no record of it, and then people say, well, it was done at squadron level because he had a big career ahead of him, and nobody wanted to tarnish that career. So there's all kind of accounts that it happened, but nobody ever knew for sure that it happened. So when I started corresponding with Colonel Castler, a couple people I says, I'd like to ask him. And so he says, well, you don't do that, don't embarrass. I said, I'm going to ask him. So I asked him, and Colonel Castor wrote me a very humorous letter about this and confirmed, yes, he did belly this airplane in. And briefly, he took off into an 800-foot overcast. He went above it, got to 20,000 feet. The airplane sputtered and quit. And then when it sputtered and quit, he headed for the ocean to bail out of the airplane, and on the way there, the overcast had came up to about 5,000 feet, and he saw a big hole, and it was drizzling rain underneath. He saw a road in the hole. So he went down through the hole to land on the road. He saw there was power lines on both sides of the road, so he said he had to pick somewhere else. So he started looking around, and there was lakes all over the place, and he found a long, flat clearing between two lakes. So he put it down in the clearing. He said that the landing was so smooth he never felt it hit the ground. But he said when he looked at the lake in front of him, he said that the lake started to disappear, and he knew there was a huge drop off at the end of this thing next to the lake. So he said he started standing on the brakes, and then he realized in all of his excitement he never put the gear down. He was sliding along on the tank, so he was along for the ride. And he said it stopped about 20 feet from the drop off, and he got out. And he said that everything was on. He was on radio, and they had him on radar. So his account was that they knew exactly where he was, including his frustration with Canadian airplanes. So they came, picked the airplane up, picked him up, and he said the first thing they did was cheer him out because he didn't bail out of the airplane. They later thanked him and had a party because he saved the airplane. They found out it was some faulty wiring with the fuel pumps, had it back flying in a week. So it's just really neat to be able to fly an airplane, put your hand on an airplane that these gentlemen have flown. And now Dale flew it last week here at Terre Haute in the Heritage Flight, and flew it this morning. It's just a real honor to be with these guys. And the neat thing about the airplane is just meeting all kinds of people that flew this airplane, and you see tears in their eyes when they see it fly, and they come over. I was at Joplin, Missouri at the end of June, and a gentleman walks over. I've seen the picture 100 times where Pete Fernandez, the second highest ace in Korea, was sitting in an airplane, and a young kid was handling him the helmet. Guy comes up and walks up and shows me this black and white picture, and he says, "Have you seen this before?" And I said, "Yeah, I've seen it 100 times." And so he says, "You recognize anything?" And I looked at it, and I says, "No, what am I looking at?" He says, "Look at me. Do you recognize anything?" And the gentleman had years on him, but I says, "My God, it's you." And he says, "I was 17 years old when I was handing him that helmet." And he had this cap off, which was from the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing in Korea. And he gave me the cap and says, "I want you to have it." So that's the thing that's really neat about this airplane, and it's just incredible. We've got it painted like Colonel Robert Rowland's airplane. We wanted to pay homage to an era that's really kind of forgotten, where they were authorized to deploy nuclear weapons during the Cold War. And we've met another gentleman. We got a letter from him that we met at Sun and Fun, Major Norm Connett, who just flipped out when he saw the airplane. He says, "I've flown this airplane just the way it's painted." Gave me the whole account, put it down in a letter where he flew it across the ocean. And it's just incredible. We met another gentleman today who's on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We got a picture of people standing in front of the airplane. He says, "That's me in that picture." And he was later a commander with the Thunderbirds. He's on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of the Air Force today. And that's the thing that's incredible about it. It's just a dream come true for me, and I'm going to turn it over to Sam because I want to listen to what Bob has to say. But I thank you for your patience and your time.
I'm sure that all you folks noticed this handsome gentleman that just came up and introduced himself to Bob Hoover. Well, he didn't introduce him. This is General Robert Olds, and he'll be here tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. We'd like all for you to come back tomorrow. Also, we didn't mention it at the start of the program, but in the red tent that's right behind you, we have some books and other items for sale. We've got Bob Hoover's book, which if you hadn't read it, you should be ashamed of yourself. It's a great book. And he'll be to sign some autographs there. He has to leave here at 2:20, so be sure and buy it and get up there quick. And if you don't buy it, we'll find out where you are and we'll make sure you buy it. Without further ado, I want to give this to Bob Hoover, and let me just say a little bit about what I know about Bob Hoover. Bob Hoover soloed when he was 16 years old. I think he bought his time a quarter of an hour at a time, over a year, till he soloed. Must be by an airport. He also taught himself acrobatics from a book. It's just kind of hard to imagine when you see his acrobatic maneuvers that he did that. He's described by General Yeager as the greatest pilot I ever saw. That was a quote. And also, General Doolittle said, Bob Hoover is the greatest stick and rudder pilot who ever lived. Without further ado, Bob.
Thank you, Sam. Wyatt, we're all proud of you for having this beautiful airplane restored as it is. This is Dale Snodgrass, one of the finest F-14 pilots I've ever met. And his commanding officer during the Gulf War told me that he was flying around the clock right at the time before he had to go home. He said he couldn't keep him out of the cockpit. He's the kind of fellow that I admire and respect, like the gentleman next to him. Robin Olds is one of the greatest heroes you'll ever meet. He got an awful lot of kills, and he would have had a dozen more over in Vietnam. However, if he got his 5th kill, they would send him home. And so he stayed on and flew gosh knows how many more missions. Robin, I'm proud of you, and Dale, I'm so proud of you. I started out on the F-86 program, and I was there, the chase pilot, as a matter of fact, on the very first flight. And that was, I think, about the 1st of October of '47. And on the first flight of the airplane, George Welch was flying it, and he went through about a 30-minute flight, and I was with him as his chase pilot in a P-80. And when he gave the countdown, I came behind him and stayed with him right from takeoff through the landing. And everything was normal until he put the gear down, and the nose gear would not extend. It was about 45 degrees. And I said, George, it's no big deal. I said, I've lost a nose gear on some airplanes, and you don't do too much damage. In this case, I don't think you'd have to worry about the engine getting damaged at all. And the people in the control room at North American said, Welch, you're not working for the Air Force. Right now, you're our test pilot, and you don't listen to anybody else. We're telling you what to do. We want you to belly the airplane in. I said, if you belly the airplane in, you're going to set the program back. And I told George, I said, George, please listen to me. Engineering came back on and said, do as we tell you to do. And on the final approach, I was right with him. He was set up for his belly landing on the lake bed at Muroc. And I said, George, just listen to me. You can't possibly get hurt. Put the gear down. And so at the last minute, he put the gear down. Main gear came down and locked. And I said, now, when you touch down, pull up the flaps and hit the speed brakes, because the flaps make the nose want to go down. And I wanted to get up, and the dive brakes have a pitch-up tendency, so I wanted everything going for him. And I said, just hold it off, hold it off, hold it off. And I was just landing right alongside of him at the same speed. And I said, it looks to me like your nose gear is extending a little bit more. Just keep the stick all the way in your gut. And he did, and the gear came out and locked before it touched. Well, you can see I've had a long association with this sweetheart. Through the program, we ran into some interesting situations. The airplane originally had boosted flight controls, and we found the boosted flight controls to be inadequate to provide the data necessary to satisfy the contract, which meant 7.33 Gs at 650 knots, and we'd have to go up above 700 because when we start pulling out, the airspeed would bleed off, and we didn't have enough stick force to get 7.33 G. So then we got smart and decided that if we got way up in speed, and we got up to about 740, this was miles an hour, not knots, that if we got the pull going and then hit the speed brakes at the same time, we could pull it out. But of course, the airspeed was dropping off rapidly. But we finally found out and figured out a way to make it go to 7.33 G and still have our data point on speed. Well, that taught us a lot. It told us that we needed a different type of flight control system. And we built a lot of those A-model airplanes, and they had slats that were actuated by the pilot. You take off and get into flight, the flaps, the leading edge slats were out. And then once you get your speed up, the slats could float back into place. No more aerodynamic lift from them. And then you had a big handle over you on the right side of the cockpit. You'd pull that and lock it. And then when you'd get ready to slow down, you'd unlock it and just reverse. So we put a different type of slat on it. And the first slats did not have side rollers. I'll show you what I'm talking about. When I do that, if that slat were like the old ones, it would rack because it didn't have side rollers. And so there was a possibility one slat, part of the slat could come out and the other part wouldn't. And I was doing spins at very low altitude to demonstrate that we didn't have a problem, and yet the Air Force were losing F-86s because they couldn't recover from a spin. And one day I was flying demonstrating the F-86 at a fighter base, and the performance I would use for the demonstration would be a max speed pass, pull into an Immelman, go right into the next Immelman, and at the top of that Immelman, I'd be about 10,000 feet above the ground, and roll it right side up and boot controls to put it into the spin. I'd do a 5-turn spin and then recover and land. Well, I'd done that hundreds and hundreds of times. And there'd been probably 25 or so airplanes lost. Many of the pilots were able to eject, but many were killed. And so on this particular flight, as soon as I put it in the spin, I knew something was wrong. It really wrapped up fast. And I looked out one side, and its slats were okay. I looked at the other side, and they were racked. And boy, I'll tell you, I couldn't see that I was going to be able to get out. I decided I'd put full throttle to it. So I did, and after about the 4th turn, it started getting up enough speed to start flying again. And I immediately got on the phone when I got on the ground and called up Smokey Caldero, and I'm sure Robin remembers that name. He was head of flight safety, 2 stars. And I said, Smokey, have your people go through all of the accident reports and clear the pilots' names because they'd all been given pilot error. I said, they legitimately had a problem. So we redesigned and then put in these side rollers, and everything was just great until the Korean War came along. Just before the Korean War, the pilots were dropping so many tanks, rightfully so. You have to throw the tanks away when you get engaged in combat. As soon as the tanks were empty, well, then you were ready to fight. So what we were trying to do to save the logistic problem of getting all of those tanks shipped over, they were so bucky, and there were 3 different companies building external fuel tanks for the F-86. And so I had the project to see how the airplane would fly without slats at all. And so what they did, they redesigned the wing, and here at the leading edge at the fuselage, it was extended. It's called a 3x6 or 6x3. Do you remember, Roman? 6.3 leading edge. And it They put a fence on it like the MiG-15. They put a fence, and this is an interesting thing from an engineering viewpoint. The very first location that they put that fence, a fence is just a sheet of metal that goes up like this, and it stops the span-wise flow on the wing, and it keeps the airflow going back over the wing straight. Now, after we got that first flight off, they decided that maybe there was a more efficient location to put the fence, or maybe more fences. It wasn't. We tried it all up and down the wing, and that first flight was right where it should have been. Only problem with the whole thing was, one day, we thought it was 25, 20, by this time we'd switched to knots, and we thought it was 25 knots faster than the airplane with the slats. And then one day I said, why don't you, to one of my friends who was pulling another test flight on the 86, I said, why don't you get with me in formation and let's open the throttles and see how much faster this airplane is. This friend of mine, Joe Lynch, was a test pilot with me and was later killed in an F-86, as a matter of fact. But he said, I said, okay, let's go full throttle. That's worth stopping for. We found out that we weren't any faster. Guess why? The pitot boom. Where is it? Yeah, here it is, over here. The pitot boom's got the red flag on it. Instead of to get an accurate reading on your airspeed indicator, you have to have that boom extended 50% of the chord. Well, when we change the length of the wing, or the chord of the wing, they forgot to extend the boom an inch and a half to keep it out in undisturbed air. And so therefore we got a higher indicated reading. And then we realized that we hadn't accomplished anything with that leading edge, except the plan was we'd get rid of external tanks and fill up that leading edge, and it would hold 70 gallons on each side. We never did use the leading edges for fuel. We developed it for that purpose, however. And then we had to prove that the airplane did have a high altitude capability that was perhaps a little bit better than the slatted wing. And I talked to the Air Force about it, and they said, we got everybody going with it, and let's just stick with it. And don't worry about it. And I kept playing with the airplane, and one day I thought, I wonder what it would be like. The stall wasn't very difficult, hardly any difference at all. I thought, what if I over-rotated? How would the airplane respond as it does with slats? Well, the answer is no. I had a lake bid to try this on 11 miles, and I took off and got up to almost a normal takeoff speed, and I rotated, and instead of dropping the nose, I held on to the controls and started uphill. The airplane just gradually stalled out and cushioned back in, and the airplane will fly right off. Well, we lost. Before I could brief, we started losing the airplanes real quick over there. And I was briefing at that forward air base up there. I can't remember where it was now, but nevertheless, I came out of the theater where I'd been briefing everybody except those pilots on alert. They took off, and one of them over-rotated. He had not heard my briefing. He went right into a group of people, Americans, who were extending the runway, and it cost him his life and I think 4 others on the ground. It was a pretty sad day for all of us. And we could see the smoke plume just as we walked out the door. At another base, I think it was K-55, I went there, and General Barkus had said to me when I came in to brief him on what I was going to be doing over there, and he said, and he used to be a group commander on F-86s, and he said, "General, you've got a different breed of cat. This fellow's one of us." He said, "I think you've asked him told him the wrong thing because you're going to have a heck of a time keeping me out of the cockpit." So at K-55, I briefed him on a dive bombing technique that we had developed. And it really worked. And before I went over, the top people in the Pentagon came out to see me demonstrate how accurate I could hit the target. And it was just amazing. I won't bore you because it's pretty technical, but I got over and first thing that happened, I was in the officers club with Frank Perigo. I don't know if you knew him, Robin, but a great gentleman and had been a friend of mine for a long time. And Frank took me into the officers club, and we were sitting at the bar, and I heard some lieutenant say, "What does that old geezer know about flying?" And I overheard him. And so I turned to the bartender, and I said, "Bartender, drinks were only about 10 cents a piece." I said, "Bartender, set up a drink for everybody in the club." And so he started working on the drinks and got them all fixed up. And I said, "And by the way, give me 3 shots of straight booze right here and a glass of water." And so when everybody got a drink, I said, "Here's a toast to the fighter pilots." Got all 3 of them down, took a sip of water. A few minutes went by, and I excused myself and went to the men's room, stuck my finger down my throat, got rid of that gin, came back to the bar, and the other fellas in the club had about half a drink left. And I said, "Boy, I don't think they make fighter pilots like I used to know them." I said, "You fellas aren't drinking up." I said, "Bartender, set them all up for another drink and bring me 3 more. Well, the next morning I went on this first mission, and I was the only one that wasn't hungover, but I did have a sore throat. Well, Marty Martin, who was a dear close friend of Robin's, he was the flight leader, he was a colonel, and he briefed everybody. There were 16 of us going on this mission. We were loaded up with bombs, 2 1,000-pound bombs plus the external tanks. And he was leading, and I was number 2. But during the briefing, he said, "The bridge is gone." And I thought, oh, boy, I know I hit that bridge. We got in formation, and guess what? Marty had an electrical system problem. He still had both bombs. Well, now those young men that were talking about the bar, what does he know? They listen. They really listen. Well, that's part of the saga of the F-86. I never had any real problems in my testing, and I did asymmetric loads externally on the spin test, and I did the spin test on several models of the airplane. It was just a sweetheart to fly, and we got all the bugs out of it eventually, and it was the most forgiving, fun flying airplane I've ever had. And I bet I can ask Robin or Dale, and they'll say the same thing. Just an honest airplane.
Bob, will you tell a little bit about the takeoff that you took out of LAX where you had the control surface problems? I mean,
Well,
that to me would be problems. You say you haven't had any problems, but
well, as I mentioned earlier, our concern was being able to pull high G to maneuver the airplane to get in a position to make a kill. And the engineering came up with an idea, and it was an early one. Up till this time, we only had boosted controls. And they gave us a design called an irreversible control system. And what it amounted to was that you holding onto the stick did not really connect you with any of the control surfaces. They were actuated by your input. And I call it like flying a potentiometer with pressure. And it had spring bungees, because the biggest problem we had was making it feel normal or conventional to the average fighter pilot who was flying the airplane. And we did that with this artificial system. Well, I had flown the airplane a couple of times, and it seemed just normal to me. And on this particular test flight, I took off out of LAX on 25 left, and as soon as I rotated, I hit the gear up only with this hand, and as soon as that gear hit the wells, the nose pitched up. My horizontal surfaces were no longer attached to the system, and they were free floating. And the airplane pitched straight up, and I did have a rudder, and it rolled off at about, I'd say 1,000 feet or so is where it stalled on me. And the nose dropped, and I thought it was going to start spinning. I stood on the rudder, and I thought, well, it's going to be a real bang here. And it came down, and without any control, it just cushioned out, and I guess it was about 100 feet above the runway. And then it went over the top of the hangar just barely, and it started up again. And this time I got smart. I thought, I'll pull the throttle back before it stalls, and then the nose will drop, and I can rudder it back level and add the power back on. And I was successful in gaining about 300 or 400 feet on every pull-up. And just because of instinct, I knew the system, but I just ripped my thumb and index finger right through here from trying to push on it. It was like in concrete. And I even got my knees behind it, still thinking that it was the old system, but didn't do any good, of course. So then I started getting more clever. For those of you who are not pilots or have never really studied aerodynamics, the reason we have a big tail back there is to balance out the loads. During some parts of your flight, you have a load that's on the bottom surface pushing the tail up, and on other phases of your flight, as a pressure, aerodynamic pressure, it's just like shifting weight from one end to the other. You have pressure on the top, and I thought, if I can just find, and I called it a sweet spot, if by using the dive brakes, the landing gear, and the flaps, and the throttle, if I can find that sweet spot where there's no pressure either on the top or the bottom of those surfaces back there, that maybe I could hold that. Of course, everybody was screaming and yelling from the very instant it happened to get out, get out, get out. Well, this was one of a kind. We built thousands of F-86s with that system, and this airplane has it. Honest to goodness, you have never ridden through a smoother landing than that landing. Those swept wings here, they got into ground effect, and it cushioned the airplane out. I guess it was pretty flat by then. And as soon as I got into ground effect, it just eased right down. It was like landing on a wet runway. It was the smoothest landing I've ever ridden through. But it did roll 11 miles. I rolled right up to the base operations there at the old Edwards base, and Jack Ridley came out to meet me. He was on the X-1 program with Chuck Yeager and myself, and Jack said, "Boy, Bob," he said, "that was the hairiest ride I've ever heard about." And I said, "Yeah, Jack, you want to feel something interesting? Look at this. Nothing happens. I got a stick in concrete." He said, "My gosh." Well, we took a look at it, and because of that, we found out what was wrong, and it was stray voltage that was common to both the normal flight control system and the alternate flight control system. We corrected it, and the rest is history. It turned out to be a great airplane with a lot of capability. You know, I had invited my friend Dick Rutan here to come over, because I thought I was going to be talking about the F-100, and I wanted to, the thing I had in my mind at the time was to talk to you about the development of an airplane from the drawing board until its demise. And I asked Dick if he would join me, because had I talked about that subject, I wanted him to share with you. Dick flew more combat hours in twice. And there, as Oliver North said, there is a real hero. He was in there saving people's lives right and left. And I'd just like to introduce you, even though we're talking about the F-100, Dick.
Now, Bob asked me to come over for a little while because he was the one that did the initial flight test development of the airplane, and I'm kind of on.
And all of you know Robin's background.
Robin said he'd like to make a little comment, if you don't mind.
Please, Robin.
I met Bob Hoover in Cleveland Air Races, first lieutenant. Not working.
Sound barrier. You want to start it?
Hello, can you hear this?
I understand Bob Hoover was first assigned to be the one to break the sound barrier, but Chuck Yeager takes that privilege. I wonder what happened and why.
Bob, the question was, he understands that, which is true, that you were the #1 choice for the X-1 program, but that you ended up being #2, and Chuck took over that. He wanted to know what happened.
Yeah, you bet. I was flying the P-59 and P-80s, our first jets, and I had already evaluated the German Heinkel 162, and I was selected for the X-1 program out of a pyramid of candidates. And a fellow by the name of Pete Everest, who was not flying jets, one morning walked into the ready room and he said, "Wonder if you'd be kind enough to pull a buzz job down at the Springfield airport, and I'll tell everybody it was me." He said, "I've talked when I should have been listening and told them I was flying jets." And I said, "Well, Pete, I'd be delighted to do it, but every test flight I have, I'm always out of fuel by the time I head back to land." And I said, "If I have a test card that leaves me with a little fuel, I'll go down and buzz the Springfield airport for you." And so one day I had such a condition where I had enough fuel to do it, and I went across upside down. And I was down low, and I came over and landed at right field. And I had already been selected for the program, and Chuck wasn't involved in it at all at that time. And months went by, Al Boyd took over flight tests, and he called me into his office, and he said, "Young man, did you buzz the Springfield airport on such and such a date?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I certainly did." And he said, "Well, I know two things about you. You're honest, because there was only one jet that flew in the whole United States that day. But," he said, "I also know that you're irresponsible. And I don't know who I'm going to select to be the #1 pilot. But you've been studying this for so long, you're going to be his #2. Well, I was now just dreading to hear whom that second person might be, because some of the candidates in that pyramid were pilots whose flying abilities I did not respect. And I think it would have been a tough thing for me to take with somebody that I didn't feel was qualified to do it. And one day he called me in and he said, "Do you know a Captain Chuck Yeager?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "That's who I've selected." And I could hardly contain myself, because the first time I met Chuck, I bounced him, and we got into a hassle, and finally we'd worked ourselves down from about 15,000 feet to the deck, and he came up. Neither one of us could get the advantage on the other, so we were just half sides of the circle. And he said, "Fella, I don't know who you are, but we better break it off before we kill ourselves." And so I came in and landed, and I didn't know who he was or who it was I jumped. And he walked over to the airplane and introduced himself. And then we both had respect for one another, and we dogfought with all of the captured, not all of them, but many of the captured German and Japanese airplanes against our airplanes, evaluating them. And I admired him more and more each day that I had flown with him prior to his selection. So you can see I was absolutely elated and delighted that I'd be working with somebody I could admire and respect. And by this time, we'd become good friends.
Next question. Okay, Bob, if you'll go over to the tent over here, we'll proceed with selling all your books.
Okay.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Robin. Thank you, Dale.